Thanks, Sylvie. And I'm told I need to keep this a little close to my mouth so you can hear me a little bit better. I'll try and do better this time. Anyway, so this is a really important topic because there are a lot of people who have kids playing sports these days, or they're young, 3, 4, 5 years old, and parents are trying to figure out which sports they should sign their kids up for. There's an awful lot of conversation in the media about and in public health circles about concussions and subconcussions, which were an element we're going to talk about as well. The man to my right, Bob Cantu, has been extremely influential in this space. His book, which is out in the lobby there, made the argument a few years ago that kids under the age of 14 or 14 and under 14 should not play tackle football. It was very controversial at the time. Now you've got other people like Benedict Malo saying, well, no, it really should be 18 and under. When we wrote the Project Play report, the 8th strategy in there was called Emphasize Prevention, which is really an argument to move the conversation from, return to play and what do you do when kids have concussions, how to get them back on the field, what are the protocols there. And so the message in the Project Play report is, well, how about if we just not have them hit heads as much as they do? So let's push toward that. And so that conversation has really grown in the past few years, and parents are very much concerned. In fact, recently there was a survey by the University of Massachusetts at Lowell that found that 4 out of 5 Americans now believe that children under the age of 14 should not play tackle football. So Bob, does this feel like a victory lap for you?
No, not really. And the age is somewhat arbitrary. And I do want to emphasize we want these kids playing flag football if they choose to want to play football. It's just that they don't play tackle football and bang heads in the process. Back in 2012, when we wrote the book, we had 40 years already in neurosurgery where we've seen a lot of kids on the other side of the desk have problems from concussions and repetitive concussions especially. And we also knew of scores of papers that had been written that would tell you that the young brain is more vulnerable to trauma than is the adult brain for a variety of reasons, structural reasons, metabolic reasons. And yet there hadn't been longitudinal studies that absolutely proved that to be the case. And I'm kind of happy now that, happier than that report from the survey, that we do have 5 studies shortly, 3 of them already in peer-reviewed journals, that basically make the point that athletes that start the sport of tackle football under the age of 12 have a greater chance to have later life cognitive, behavioral, and mood issues than individuals who started it at a younger age, at an older age, beyond the age of 12, assuming that you went on to play it at a National Football League level. These are all people that went on to those kinds of careers.
So what about, so the 5 studies, talk us a little bit more about what those mean. What later life cognitive outcomes that aren't so great, what do you mean, loss of memory?
Yes, basically they were studied with psychological tests that are like IQ equivalent tests, especially executive function, reasoning, judgment, as well as memory and attention tests. And athletes that had an earlier exposure to tackle football scored poor, statistically poor on those tests than individuals that started football at a later age.
What about like emotional issues, depression or otherwise? Is there any connection?
There seems to be. Some of the work that's been done has shown, in addition to the cognitive issues, that they've had more trouble with frustrating circumstances, irritability, short fuse type problems, and also greater problems with mood issues, especially anxiety and depression.
So we know this about players who went on to play at the NFL level. What about a kid who played up through the end of high school or maybe even college? What do we know about them starting football early and poor outcomes later in life?
Those longitudinal studies have not been done. We do have one paper coming out soon that suggests, and it's a pilot study, it suggests that if you played football for 5.5 years, you probably didn't reach a critical threshold that put you at any greater risk for later life issues than someone who hadn't played football at all. If you played it between 5 and 12.5 years, there was some slight increased risk for later life issues. But if you played it more than 12.5 years, that's when it seemed to be like falling off the cliff, and that seemed to be the dividing. Now, whether that's going to be proven out by larger studies, we'll have to see. It would be pretty wonderful if there really were thresholds that you could see and use in advising people.
Now, Chris, when did you tell us about your athletic pathway and when you began to play football?
Right. So I'm actually fortunate that I was a punter, so I wasn't subjected to the same amount of hits that the other guys were. I didn't start playing football until high school. I played baseball and soccer growing up, and then started playing football in high school because I needed a fall sport, and it was either that or cross country, and I hated running. I quickly found out football was a lot of running on the first two-a-day, so I still made a poor choice, but it worked out for me. But yeah, no, it's definitely, even in high school when I was playing, I mean, you'd have, linebackers doing thud drills, linemen butting up against each other. And a lot of people think of concussions as that big hit going across the middle where, the guy's out for the game. And yeah, those happen and those are dangerous, but every single practice, guys are smacking their heads against each other because that's what the game is. Like that's what football is. You're lining up across from another person and you're trying to run into each other as hard as you can. And there's no way to stop that from happening. Like, that is the basis of the game.
You're talking about what are known as subconcussive blows. Bob, can you explain the difference between a concussion and a subconcussive blow and its impact on the brain?
The definition of concussion has changed a lot over the last 40 years. 40 years ago, you really had to be rendered unconscious to be thought of as having a concussion, and then in the late 70s that changed to just being stunned or your alertness being somewhat impaired a little bit. And now today the majority of concussions are really without any significant alteration in level of consciousness, but just the production of symptoms that are recognized as concussion symptoms. So it's really based upon the symptoms. Well, a blow that produces symptoms is defined as a concussion. A blow that does not result in symptoms but violently shakes the brain, whether it's direct to the head or other part of the body that just whiplashes the head, that would be called a subconcussive blow.
And what do we know about the number of subconcussive blows that youth players and high school players incur in the course of a season?
We know it goes up. We know that at the Pop Warner level, the youth leagues, most of the leagues have shown when they have been studied, and there aren't that many studies at that level, the kids are taking on average 150 to 200 blows a year. As you get to high school, the average is closer to 800 to 1,000. As you get to college, it goes up from that. Now, that's assuming that you are talking about the way high school ball used to be practiced, college ball used to be practiced. It's changing.
So what is a greater danger, concussion or subconcussive blows, based upon what we know from the science right now?
Yeah, we don't know how to equate. There's no question that one concussion is a greater potential injurious problem for the brain than one subconcussive blow. But if you take tens of thousands of subconcussive blows, because as Chris was saying, you're a lineman hitting on every single play, you don't have to be concussed to wind up with later life problems. And we have a number of people that have been diagnosed with CTE upon their death that had no recognized concussions during their life, but took tens of thousands of subconcussive blows in the ring or as a football lineman, say.
So do you still, is 14 and under still the number you go by, or have you adjusted that?
I've not adjusted the number. As far as I'm concerned, high school is the age where you kind of have to make decisions. If somebody's not skeletally mature, I would even be happy if you wanted to defer it later. But I think at some point you're going to have to start playing the sport the the way it's going to get you a scholarship to go to college and so on. And that's why we kind of make the arbitrary decision about the age of 14.
What do you think, Chris? What's the appropriate age?
I mean, based on what I've seen and just from being around guys in the league and seeing the natural athleticism of players, I would say you could make a very strong argument that you shouldn't have tackling until college. I mean, the basic skills of football, being able to move your body in space, running fast, identifying routes, catching passes, dropping back in coverage, those can all be learned without hitting someone. And you can teach tackling techniques within a couple years. Yeah, you're probably not going to be as good at it as if you had practiced for 8 years, 10 years, 12 years. But the equation there is how good do you want to be at tackling versus how much do you want to protect the brain? And I think that one of those is more important than the other. And it's probably the brain. So I think high school is probably what will end up happening. I think not allowing tackling drills until college would probably be more ideal, but that's a choice that society has to make.
Now, the American...
Just to weigh in and not say there's anything that's black and white, because it isn't. I think what's really crucial is that no matter what age you pick, or whether you pick high school or you pick college, 60% of the rattling of the cage, your brain inside your skull, happens in practice. Mm-hmm. And if you change the way you practice, as has happened in the NFL, where you have 14 full contact practices during 18 weeks of the season, that's less than once a week. And many coaches, Jeff Fisher among them, don't hit in season once the season starts. And you can't hit outside of the season. It's all shells and helmets or less. If you were to do that in college, if you were to do that in high school, you drastically reduce the amount of head trauma these athletes are taking. And there are ways to learn to tackle thud drills and others besides simply bringing somebody to the ground.
The Ivy League this year followed, they adopted a rule that there will be no tackling, no contact, full contact in practices during the week, only in games. And it's because Dartmouth adopted the same idea a few years ago and went on to win the Ivy League championship. So now it's a league-wide thing. What do you think of that rule, and what type of impact might it have as rippling through the system?
Well, I think it's a great rule because it's preserving the brains of these individuals. It's allowing them to practice tackling. At Dartmouth, Buddy Tevens, the coach, has had a former player actually develop a robot, which is just that. It's a robot that it's a mannequin that moves all over, and the guys practice tackling. But they have a number of other drills that simulate what happens in game play. It's just that you don't bring somebody to the ground, so that you really save it all up for the weekend.
Yeah, and one thing I'd like to add is that, having played in the NFL for 8 years and watching NFL practices and, watching meetings and stuff like that, 90% of making a successful tackle is being in the right position to make the tackle, which means you're studying film, you're studying tendencies, you're working on the right coverages, making sure you're dropping back into the right area. And so you don't actually need to tackle the person to know where you're supposed to be in order to make that tackle. There's, it's this idea of, we have to be rough and gritty and tough and, get down in the dirt and smash into each other. And you don't actually need that to be good at the game of football. I mean, you're out there, you're going to have to tackle on Sunday under the lights. I mean, that's part of the game, but during the week, it's absolutely not necessary. You need to know where you're supposed to be, and that comes through repetition. And if you're adding tackling at the end of each of those reps, then you're just causing damage to the brain you've already gotten most of the work out of the drill already. You know where you're supposed to be.
The question of no tackle football before the age of 14 or even through high school, the American Academy of Pediatrics doesn't agree. In fact, they issued a position statement just a few months ago where they looked at all of the literature in the space and said there's not sufficient evidence to discourage tackle football at any age. Instead, they said get the coaches trained, better equipment, so on and so forth. How do you feel about the AAP's statement, Bob?
They'll come around. They just have to read a few more papers. In my opinion, they're very wrong. I know the people that wrote that paper. I know the pressures behind it. And if you think you have pressures at IOC, you've got every bit of pressures in a lot of academia and other institutions. Many of those people are involved with organizations that could be construed as a conflict.
Well, and the other thing too is you look at the NFL has a rich history of covering up the evidence of concussions. I mean, they had a rheumatoid arthrologist as their concussion expert for how many years? It's
Elliot Pellman was their chief medical officer.
Yeah, it's
Was.
Was. I think he still advises though. Is he gone now?
Just recently.
Okay, but the big question is you're saying we don't have the evidence to make this. Well, the question is, why don't we have this evidence? Why isn't the NFL taking some of its billions of dollars a year and doing help funding these longitudinal studies? There was a recent kerfluffle over the big settlement thing, right, where they were supposed to be funding a study from, God, I forget who it was, a big concussion study. It was like $20 million, $30 million, and they were going to pull their grant out because they didn't like the fact that they were going to do actual research on concussions. So, I mean, I think people need to start putting a lot more pressure. Like, if we really want to protect players' brains, if we're really that concerned about our kids growing up and playing football, we need to be talking to the NFL, sending letters, calling them, saying, hey, why aren't you letting scientists do research on this? What's the deal?
I want to go back a little bit here. Bob, you suggested there was pressure put on the AAP to issue a statement that was not... Where would that pressure come from?
No, I'm not suggesting that these individuals acted other than what they honestly thought. And there is, to make change is difficult. To go with the status quo, even though the status quo has a lot of evidence that it's not correct, it's an uphill battle. And that uphill battle unquestionably will be successful. If that poll was really accurate, that 80% of people in this country don't believe you should be playing football before high school, the case could be made. I don't know how accurate that poll is.
I want to talk to you about the role of coaches, the importance of having coaches trained, and how effective of a that is as a way to manage risks in football. But why don't we, I want to show you a clip from a piece of mine that will air this Sunday on Outside the Lines about a young man in LA. And this is not about a concussion case. This is well, you'll see, it's a different type of injury, but it speaks to the coaching issue. Could you pull that up? Of playing the game. Long Beach, California. Donovan Hill grew up here, the only child of a single mother.
I call him Mr. Personality. He's a sweet kid, loves his mom. The first time you meet him, you just fall in love with him.
Donovan began playing flag football at age 5 and excelled immediately. Playing Pop Warner at age 13, he was known for his breakaway speed on offense and his tenacity for running down opponents on defense. His head coach was Sal Hernandez.
He just went so hard all the time, and that was this, the competitiveness, the feistiness in that kid.
It's a captain's break, ladies and gentlemen.
On November 6, 2011, Donovan's team in red and black played in the Southern California Championship game. On the third play from scrimmage, Donovan ran for the game's first score.
Touchdown, Donovan Hill.
Then, late in the game, Donovan was on defense when he attempted to make a tackle near the goal line.
It instantly got really quiet. Donovan wasn't moving at all.
And that's when things start to run through my mind about this might be serious.
The first thing he looked up and he goes, "Mom, I love you." That's the only thing he said is, "Mom, I love you." Like he was telling me that he was okay.
I remember I was on the bed and they was asking, they'll sing what I could feel or not. I was like, "Can you feel this? Can you feel that?" And I kept saying no.
Doctors confirmed what everyone feared. Donovan's neck was broken. He was paralyzed from the neck down. A closer look at the play reveals what happened.
I saw him run through the line, and I thought somebody was going to tackle him, and I just came full speed, head first.
Was this something Donovan did a lot, putting his head down?
Unfortunately, yeah. And I'll be honest, I would say things like, you know, you keep hitting like that, you're going to end up in a goddamn wheelchair.
Donovan consistently led with his head when making a tackle, a dangerous technique banned by Pop Warner and other organizations all the way up to the NFL. Where did you learn that technique?
Coach it.
Your coaches?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, which coach?
mostly my head coach, Sal.
The head coach, Sal Hernandez.
Yes.
And what did you think of that technique? Did you have any concerns about it?
Yes. I didn't like it.
You didn't like it. Did you express those concerns?
Yeah. I told him that this is not the right way you hit.
Donovan says he raised his concerns during a hitting drill that season when a teammate was leading with his head.
I told the coach that I'm going to get hurt like this. Like, I don't want to. This is not the right thing to do. And they just told me to, like, stop whining. And they sent me to the back.
Do you recall that situation
No,
at all?
no.
You don't recall any situation where a kid was leading with his head and Donovan complained and you said, "Donovan, stop complaining"?
No, I don't recall a conversation like that happening.
Coach Sal said he didn't remember that particular situation, wasn't sure if he was there.
Yeah, he was.
He was there.
Yeah.
And he was yelling it at Donovan.
Yeah.
And what was Coach Sal telling Donovan?
Same thing as all the coaches. Get back in line. Stop being scared.
Assistant coach Manny Martinez confirmed the incident.
I know the exact moment. We have this kid, he goes in to hit Donovan, and Donovan kind of backs out. And we're saying, "What are you doing? Go hit. There's your hitting drills. You got to go." He's saying he's hitting with his head. It's like, no, he's not hitting with his head. He's hitting with his forehead. That's kind of where you're supposed to hit if you're going head up.
And after that, I just started hitting with my head because that's what they told me to do.
Pop Warner's approved tackling technique calls for sliding the helmet to the side and discourages hitting with any part of the head. That technique was part of an online training course that head coach Sal Hernandez was required to take, but he never did. And at the time, Pop Warner didn't mandate that assistant coaches like Martinez take the training. So how do you know about tackling?
Been playing since I was 10 years old.
But how do you know what is truly the right way versus what you've learned in the past if you haven't taken the test and learned the curriculum?
I couldn't say. I mean, I only know what I've been taught.
We need to elongate your arms, remember?
Donovan began physical therapy,
Bring it up.
but because of limited insurance coverage, it didn't last long. His mother quit her job as a grocery store supervisor to care for him full-time. As the medical bills piled up, $2 million in the first year, Donovan and his mother filed suit against Pop Warner and his coaches for gross negligence. So who bears responsibility for what happened to you?
The people that taught me how to hit this way.
Your coaches. What emotions do you have for your coaches?
I still love all my coaches.
Still love them.
Yeah, all my coaches, yes.
He said, "I still love my coaches." How does it make you feel?
I love them, and It's a coach's nightmare.
What would you like others to learn from your situation?
Do what you think is the best and never be pressured into doing something you know that isn't right.
So a couple, that's a part of a whole half-hour show, and you'll see what happened to Donovan, but I'll just give away the punchline here. He, in January, he settled his lawsuit with Pop Warner, which was a groundbreaking lawsuit worth millions of dollars. Signed the paperwork in May, and a week later he died. He went in the hospital, from a surgical procedure related to his injury and hit an artery, and he died. So the story is very much about a tribute to Donovan, this kid who actually ended up forcing some changes in youth football. You know, he was one of the voices, along with Bob and other folks who really kind of helped put this issue at the forefront. But let me ask you this, Bob. You know, a few years ago, when the NFL and USA Football got motivated about training coaches, about 43% of them were trained in concussion management. Based upon our research in the State of Play report, it's still at about 43% right now. We haven't seen much progress in the past few years. So my question is, can the culture of youth football, given that it is dominated by well-meaning but volunteers who are often winging it, can it be reformed? Can we get it to the point where people like those two coaches, one of whom's a barber and the other one's a Hollywood actor, can actually create an environment to protect children?
Tom, I honestly believe it can. I think it's going to require society getting behind it, number one. Number two, I hate to say this way, but that's the second lawsuit against Pop Warner last year that got settled. Lawsuits and the consequences of them can also make people step up and do a better job. Don't like to use that as a reason, but it is a factor. I think we just have to hold the coaches accountable. They are volunteers. They are not being paid. They are giving up a lot of hours. Many of them are parents, and so that's why they do it, but not all of them are. But it's just too important when you're dealing with youngsters' brains and spinal cords not to know the proper way to teach the techniques of the sport.
I think it's time for a little Q&A. Anybody? Yes, ma'am. Let's wait for the microphone.
My name is Roberta Turkett. In fact, my husband was one of the radiologists for the Dallas Cowboys 50 years ago when all of this started. But my question is not about the NFL. It's about the Warrior Girls, the book on teenage soccer. These kids, these girls are heading the ball at 8, 9, 10 years old. There is no money in school's budget for helmets. What do you do with these children? They want to be the best.
And I'm glad we made that turn, because although football dominates the conversation around head trauma in the U.S., and parents are by far concerned about football more than any other sport, there are issues in soccer, particularly girls soccer, girls lacrosse, hockey as well. So we should definitely acknowledge that. But I don't know, Bob, did you want to take that question?
I'd be happy to, in the sense that when we wrote the book in 2012, we took on 3 sports. Ice hockey, no full body checking under the age of 14. They've come up to 13 in age. First, it's under 14, so we're happy there. We took on no heading in soccer until age 14. Soccer, just in the last year, has come up with no heading under the age of 10, and between 11 and 13 limited heading. So they've made some movement in the right direction, a lot of it because Brandy Chastain has gotten behind it as a very positive media person. So I think it is important. In soccer, the majority of concussions happen in the act of heading the ball because heads collide and other body parts collide. And to a certain extent, repetitive heading with a weak neck, underdeveloped brain, can, in certain instances, cause brain injury itself as well, but that's less well studied than the concussion issue.
Anybody else?
So I'll apologize because I'm pretty I'm not educated in the finer points of football, but a guy who works for me now, he's the old president of finance for the Denver Broncos, and he always says to me, the way you solve this problem is, starting at a very young age, just don't use helmets anymore. Like that, no one will hit with the head if there's no helmets. Yeah, well, this is my reaction to him too. So my question is there any validity to that, or is he just a little bit off the reservation? I mean, you know how accountants are.
So the reason they introduced helmets in the first place was because people were dying on the football field. I believe that was back in Teddy Roosevelt's time. And it always cracks me up when people say, oh, just don't use helmets. Then guys won't put their heads in there. It's like, you don't understand. Guys are running at full speed. You can't just stop. Like physically, there's no way to stop and not move your head, move your head out of the way if you're going to have a collision. And so football players are going to run hard. They're going to tackle each other. That's the whole point of the game. And a big problem with football, when it comes to concussions and injuries like that, is it is a game of directly opposing forces. You have two teams lined up directly across from each other, and they're running straight into each other. It's, there are very few sports like that. Rugby tends to be a bit more kind of diagonal angles. Same with Aussie rules football. Like it's not the full-on head-to-head collision. And so when people talk about not wearing helmets, then it's generally fairly obvious that they've never played football at a college or professional level because it's ludicrous to think that taking the helmet away is somehow going to keep a guy who runs a 4.2 40 from running full speed into another guy who runs a 4.3 40, both of whom weigh roughly 200 to 230 pounds. Like the helmet is there so that your neck doesn't shatter and your skull falls apart. I'm not a fan of that argument. If you can tell.
What about rugby? Large men running into each other.
Right. Well, no, and that's why I said rugby is much more diagonal forces. And there's in rugby there's also much less of an incentive to fight for that extra yard because the try goes, you can pass it off, right? If it goes down, then it goes in the scrum. You don't need that extra yard in order for your team to continue playing. Whereas football, if it's 4th and 1, you better believe that both teams are coming full bore at each other. Like there's no stopping there. And it's taught to you as a player. It's 4th and 1, you better get your nose in the dirt, you better bow up and make sure that they don't get that yard. Conversely on offense, you better get that yard. So
we consult for World Rugby, and it is interesting that at the elite level, rugby players, just like in all other sports, are bigger, faster, stronger, and believe me, concussions are a big issue in rugby. Everything Chris said, by the way, is true, but there's no question head contacting in rugby is an issue, and CTE is becoming increasingly recognized in ex-rugby players as well, unfortunately.
Yeah, I didn't want to minimize rugby by any means. Like that's also a field that needs to be looked at.
I just have one real short question, just to follow up on that. In a sport like I'm involved in cycling, where we are mobile all the time, we're out on open roads, we have a lot of concussion issues, but the concussion issues are just, the crash, guy hits the road. Oftentimes there's not anyone medically trained in the support vehicles. How do you make the snap decision as a coach or director whether or not the athlete is fit to get, because I'll tell you, 99 times out of 100, you leave the decision to the athlete, they will get back on the bike and they will wobble around their way to the finish line half conscious. Obviously I can identify really bad cases, but the ones in the middle, it's hard.
You need independent neurologists. I mean, that's something the NFL has to have, and they don't quite have it yet. They say they have it, but you need legit independent neurologists who don't answer to the teams, they don't answer to the league. They're on site and they can make that decision, and that they have the power to stop the game in order to make that decision. And it's going to make the games less fun to watch, but it's also going to help save people.
Gretchen?
I want to piggyback off of Jonathan's questions because I think a lot of people don't realize also the idea with the helmet is to actually protect our skulls, not necessarily our brains, and it's our brains bouncing back and forth in our skull that actually causes a concussion and a traumatic brain injury, which so many people don't know this. My question is, thoughts around using technology, using a helmet as a technology piece to potentially activate something to determine the impact that an athlete has had, because another part of concussion is this idea that I'm fine. It's something that so many people who've suffered concussions experience of, I'm fine, and it's because the brain is actually
not fine,
has been injured, and it's sending these mixed signals. So how can we use technology to sort of help with this?
Well, there is no technology now that lets you know when you have a concussion. There are a lot of products out there yet to be validated. There are accelerometers that are useful in letting you know that you've been hit, but the accuracy of what they're actually measuring is in the process of being validated. So for a minute, let's think about what a helmet can do and can't do, because I think it's an important concept. What a helmet does very well with a hard outer polycarbonate or carbon fiber shell is take energies and spread them to what is the inner liner. So if you have a focal linear impact, like a ball-peen hammer hitting you in the head, which fortunately we don't in sport, but we have sticks, and we have baseballs, and we have other balls. If they hit you in the head, light mass, high velocity, a helmet protects you from concussion. If you have some other person weighing 200 pounds with a rigid neck hitting you in the head, your head's going to be violently moved in space no matter whether you have a helmet on or not. It will protect you from a skull fracture. It will decrease your chance for an intracranial bleed, and that's reason enough to wear them. But it won't do very much for concussion because the head's going to be violently rotated just because of the masses involved. And that's the catch-22 we have in sports like football and lacrosse and so on, where the helmet does a great job protecting against skull fracture and intracranial bleeds, doesn't do a very good job against concussion, probably never will.
From a scientific standpoint, would you say the NFL should be putting accelerometers in every single helmet of every single player in order to get that longitudinal study, so you could see if there were certain impacts that were more likely to lead to concussions?
They would like to, and they tried to a couple years ago, and the Players Association blocked them. And the Players Association blocked them because they were concerned that the breach could happen, that how many hits somebody took over a course of a season could be used against them in being hired for the next year, even though it was supposed to be, blinded. So actually, yeah, it would be a good idea to know those very things, but the Players Association blocked it.
So you're saying players need guaranteed contracts?
That's
Got a question over here.
Yeah, so again, I'm
Especially
with
kickers.
Aspen Youth Soccer, and yeah, we are definitely working towards no heading the ball. There's still a lot of muddled waters trying to figure out what age we're doing that at. We're still waiting for the USSF to actually determine when they're gonna put the age limit on it from a standpoint of actually officiating that. But I think for me, I'm going to say something that's really unpopular. I don't agree with you in the whole concussion thing. I'm terrified that 80% of people wouldn't let their kids play sports. Things
that's not what it said. You misunderstood.
Or tackle football.
14
I agree. I'm really worried that we're heading down a road that, sports, teamwork, dedication, determination, passion, you learn all those things through sports, right? So I'm worried that people that, I'm sure they'll learn it in other ways, but I don't want to see people missing out on opportunities to play sports because they're held back in fear. What do you think do you think that obviously with the movie Concussion that we will eventually circle back, or will this continue to keep going at the rate that it is? With people fearing team sports and contact sports. at this level?
I don't think it's so much fear as it is a person's desire to have informed consent. Where as a football player, if I'm going to go out, or as a parent of someone who could be a football player, I want to know that the decision I'm making, I can account for every variable, both positive and negative, right? So if I put my kid into tackle football, I want to know if there's a chance that my kid could develop a debilitating brain injury down the line, that's something I can take into account. Right now, we still don't know that yet. You know, we're doing the research, we're trying to figure that out, but like something I hear a lot is, oh, well, you know, football players, they knew the risks. That's, you know, they chose to play the game. We don't know the risks. Speaking personally, as someone who's been in a locker room, none of the players in there knew the risks of concussions. There are lots of guys who are very worried about, am I going to be able to function when I'm older? Great, I made $20 million. Am I going to remember my family's name? Am I going to recognize my children? Do I even know that I have $20 million when I turn 50 or 55? Like, you know, what's the point of the money if I don't know who I am? And so really that's what all of this is that sports are great. I don't want football to go away. I learned a lot from football. I learned a lot from team sports. I want kids to play team sports, but I don't want that to be at the cost of children losing their future, right? I don't want that to be at the cost of someone's brain disintegrating later in life, because I don't think that's an appropriate price to pay.
I think it's important also, and I'm just echoing what Chris just said, we don't want any kid not to play sport. And I don't want a kid that doesn't play tackle football to not play flag football. And you can learn all the things, except maybe the pain to the same degree, of playing flag football that you can learn from tackle football. And in terms of the movie Concussion, I think we're going to relentlessly go forward in spite of that movie.
So is the last question here, let me just sort of wrap it up. So is the pathway forward for football in this country, is it the same pathway that hockey, for instance, has taken, where they have the policy in hockey is now no body checking up through Pee Wee age, age 13 or so, but they introduce contact, in practices. Football hasn't done that. They haven't said, look, the NFL, the NCAA, the powers that be haven't come out and said, look, flag football is really the way to go up through a certain age, and we get all the coaches trained in proper technique, and then we introduce it maybe at the high school level. I mean, is it going to more of a methodical progression-based model as opposed to, listen, everybody do what you want to do, and let's just hope your coaches are trained?
I think that's what's going to happen, and I think we are seeing that happen. We're seeing flag football increase in numbers, and we're seeing at the youth level tackle football decreasing in numbers in terms of participation. I just think that it's important, and it's going to be a slow, progressive thing, but I think the one big bullet, and it'll probably have to come at the NFL level, which surprisingly all the big changes have come at that level, not at the youth level where the kids are most vulnerable. I think the next big thing that has to happen is, okay, so we've identified defenseless players. Chris, kicking the ball, somebody receiving the ball, passing the ball, can't hit him in the head. Can't hit anybody in the head intentionally. Sure, it's going to happen a lot accidentally, but you can't line somebody up from 20 yards away and drill them. And I think that's going to have to come to football. That has come to the National Hockey League. You cannot check to the head without penalty. They get hit in the head all the time from checks that slide up, but it's not targeting the head. And I think that's the next big step, which in combination with the practice changes could make football a great deal safer.
I want to thank our panel, Bob and Chris. They're terrific.
Thank you, everyone.